Canada just made the biggest mistake in its modern history. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before the cameras and delivered a declaration that sent shock waves through the political world. With a straight face, he announced that Canada was cutting ties with the United States, economically, militarily, strategically, just like that. No negotiations. No second thoughts. The message was clear. Canada was done with its biggest ally, its largest trading partner, its shield in global conflicts. And why? Not for national security, not for economic growth. No, Carney made this decision out of pure hatred for Donald Trump. But here's what Carney didn't expect. Trump saw it coming. While Canada was busy virtue signaling, Trump was already 10 steps ahead, securing America's economy, protecting its border, and ensuring that whatever damage Carney tried to inflict would land squarely on Canada itself. This wasn't leadership. This was self-destruction. Carney's words were like a bomb dropped on an already shaky foundation. The old relationship we had with the United States is over, he declared. That's not a strategic pivot. That's suicide. 77% of Canada's exports go directly to the U.S. Only 18% of America's exports flow north. Who do you think needs who more? And yet Carney acted like he was holding the winning hand. His plan: shift trade to other nations, rebuild the economy from scratch, and somehow make Canada independent of the one country keeping it afloat. The arrogance was staggering. This wasn't about policy. This wasn't about making Canada stronger. This was about one thing and one thing only: sticking it to Trump, even if it meant bringing the entire country down with him. But while Carney played his childish game, Trump stood firm. He wasn't about to let America pay for Canada's reckless decision-making. "I'm not letting the American people pay the price for this insanity," Trump declared in response. And that's the difference between leadership and a political tantrum. Trump was focused on protecting America, ensuring that every household, every business, and every worker remains shielded from Canada's economic suicide. Carney, he was out to score points with globalist elites, hoping for applause from the same people who have spent years trying to dismantle national sovereignty. But the problem with gambling everything to hurt Trump is that in the end, you only hurt yourself. As Trump strengthened America's economy, Canada was already starting to feel the consequences of its recklessness. The Canadian dollar wobbled. Foreign investors hesitated. Even within his own ranks, murmurs of doubt began to spread. Had Carney just doomed Canada's economic future over a petty grudge? Meanwhile, Americans saw the situation for what it was: another desperate attempt by leftist leaders to defy Trump, even when it meant harming their own people. But Trump was unshaken. His administration had already been preparing for this moment. Contingency plans were in place, alternative trade routes secured, and diplomatic relationships strengthened to ensure that whatever void Canada left would be filled without a hitch. "Trump is always 10 steps ahead," one supporter said. He saw this coming before Carney even took office. And that's the reality. Canada thought they could stand up to Trump. They thought they could force America into a corner. But Trump didn't flinch. While Canada stumbled, Trump stood firm. America was safe. Its economy, its security, its future protected. Now the question isn't whether America will be fine. It's whether Canada can survive the disaster it just unleashed on itself. Mark Carney might have thought he was dealing a blow to Trump, but he never realized Trump was prepared for this all along. The moment Canada severed ties with the U.S., the economic gears began shifting, and everyday Americans were about to feel the impact. Mark Carney's reckless decision wasn't just a symbolic middle finger to Trump. It was a direct hit to key American industries. Canada had been a major supplier of lumber, oil, and natural resources. And now, with those supply lines in question, the costs were bound to rise. But here's what Carney didn't consider: Trump was ready. While Canada braced for economic freefall, Trump had already been securing new deals, ensuring that whatever leverage Canada thought it had over the U.S. evaporated before they could use it. This wasn't Trump's first trade war, and he wasn't about to let the American people suffer for Carney's political theater. For years, Canada had depended on its economic relationship with the U.S. to stay afloat. 77% of its exports went straight to American markets, while only 18% of U.S. exports were sent to Canada. That meant when Carney cut ties, he wasn't just playing a risky game. He was going all in on a losing hand. And the first people to feel the pain? Canadian businesses. With American buyers already looking elsewhere, Canadian industries faced immediate turmoil. Factory orders were slashed. Supply chains disrupted. Investments stalled. And yet in Ottawa, Carney stood firm, doubling down on his defiant rhetoric. But his resolve wasn't mirrored on the streets. In cities across Canada, small business owners were panicking. Industries that had been stable for decades suddenly found themselves on shaky ground. The financial markets reacted accordingly. The Canadian dollar dipped. Major investors started pulling back. And in the quiet corners of the political world, murmurs of doubt began to spread. How long could Carney keep this up before the pressure became unbearable? Meanwhile in America, Doug Ford's bold proclamation echoed across the border. We will cause as much pain as possible to the American people while protecting our own. It was meant to sound tough, a warning. But to most Americans, it sounded laughable. Pain on the world's largest economy? A nation that had spent the last 4 years under Trump rebuilding its manufacturing base, expanding its energy production, and making itself more self-sufficient than ever before? The reality was, Canada's threats weren't being taken seriously. While Ford blustered, Trump acted. Within days of Canada's announcement, Trump moved to secure new trade agreements, locking in lumber and energy deals with other allies: Brazil, Mexico, even domestic suppliers. Prices in the U.S. remained stable. Businesses kept running, and American consumers barely felt a thing. Canada, on the other hand, was spiraling. Carney had made the grave mistake of assuming the U.S. needed Canada more than Canada needed the U.S. He believed his country held leverage over Trump, that he could cut off supplies and leave America scrambling. But Trump had spent years preparing for moments like this. He knew that in a global economy, alliances shift, supply chains adjust, and markets correct themselves. And most importantly, he knew Canada couldn't afford to play hardball. So when Ford and Carney stood before their people, vowing to hurt the United States, Americans didn't blink. They just shrugged and moved on. But the same couldn't be said for Canadians. Emission. With every passing week, as factories shut down and jobs disappeared, the frustration grew. People started asking the uncomfortable question: had their leaders just gambled away their country's future over a personal vendetta against Trump? Narration. And here's where it gets even worse for Canada. Trump wasn't done. While Carney played defense, scrambling to contain the fallout, Trump was still on the offense. He had already started moving to ensure Canada's absence would never be felt again. New deals were being signed, new supply chains formed, and slowly but surely, the U.S. economy adjusted. Canada had made itself expendable. And once that reality set in, once the economic numbers started rolling in and the people of Canada saw the consequences firsthand, there would only be one question left to ask. Who would take the blame for this disaster? Mark Carney, Doug Ford, or the entire progressive movement that had pushed this reckless, self-destructive agenda forward? The answer would come soon enough. Because while America moved on, Canada was only beginning to feel the weight of its decision. Emission. They said the southern border was the real crisis. That's where the drugs were coming from. That's where the human trafficking networks were strongest. But they were wrong. While the media obsessed over illegal crossings from Mexico, something even more dangerous was happening up north. The U.S.-Canada border, once considered the safest international boundary in the world, had become a highway for criminals. Narration. And Mark Carney had just made it worse. By severing ties with the U.S., Canada wasn't just cutting off trade. It was cutting off cooperation on border security, refusing to help stop the flood of drugs, illegal immigration, and human trafficking pouring into American communities. Emission. And what did Carney do when Trump called on him to secure Canada's side of the border? He ignored it. He turned his back. He made his choice. And now, Americans were going to pay the price. Narration. For years, Trump had been sounding the alarm. He knew the numbers. He had the reports. And they all said the same thing. Thousands of pounds of fentanyl, heroin, and meth were making their way across the northern border every year. Just last year alone, Border Patrol seized over 50 tons of illegal drugs smuggled in from Canada. Emission. That's not just a number. That's tens of thousands of lives destroyed. Families ripped apart. Communities drowning in addiction. And Carney knew it. He knew what was happening. But instead of stepping up, instead of working with Trump to shut it down, he chose to make it worse. Because for Canada's progressive leadership, hating Trump mattered more than saving lives. Narration. The consequences hit immediately. Without intelligence sharing, without joint operations between U.S. and Canadian law enforcement, the northern border became a free-for-all. Criminal networks adapted quickly. Smugglers moved faster. Human traffickers took advantage of new gaps in enforcement. And in small towns across the northern United States, law enforcement officials were sounding the alarm. But the mainstream media? Silent. Omission. They didn't want to talk about it. Because admitting the truth meant admitting that Trump was right. It meant acknowledging that this wasn't just a southern border crisis. It was a national border crisis. Narration. Trump didn't wait for the media to catch up. He acted. Within days of Carney's announcement, he ordered a full-scale surge of border security reinforcements to the northern border. More surveillance, more patrols, more funding for local law enforcement. If Canada wasn't going to do its job, Trump would make sure America could handle the problem on its own. The message was clear. America wouldn't be held hostage by Carney's reckless decisions. Omission. But while Trump was locking things down, Canada was coming apart at the seams. Because while Carney could ignore Trump, he couldn't ignore the chaos brewing in his own backyard. Crime rates in Canada were rising. Drug overdoses spiked. With the border wide open and no cooperation with the U.S., criminal organizations inside Canada were thriving. And ordinary Canadians were starting to notice. They saw their neighborhoods change. They saw violent crime creeping into unsafe areas. And suddenly, Carney's anti-Trump crusade didn't seem so noble anymore. It seemed stupid, dangerous, self-destructive. Narration. But by the time his own citizens started asking questions, it was too late. The damage was already done. Back in Washington, Trump was clear in his response. Trump. We're securing our border with or without them. Omission. That was the difference between Trump and Carney. One leader was focused on protecting his country. The other was too busy trying to prove a point. And for Canada, that mistake was about to cost them more than they ever imagined. Because as America secured itself, the real question became clear. If Carney had willingly made his own country more dangerous, if he had knowingly turned Canada into a weak spot for criminals to exploit, then who was really in charge up there? Who was pulling the strings behind this disastrous decision? And more importantly, how much worse was it going to get? Narration. He used to be a guy who promised to stand up for the hardworking people of Ontario. The one politician in Canada who wasn't completely sold out to the globalist agenda. He campaigned as a conservative, as a fighter. But when the time came to make a choice, when he could have stood with Trump, secured the border, and put Canada first, he didn't. Omission. He turned on everything he claimed to believe in. And instead of defending his own people, he went on the attack against the United States. Ford. We will cause as much pain as possible to the American people while protecting our own. Tough words. But let's be real. What was Ford really saying? That he cared more about hurting Trump than saving Canadian jobs? That he'd rather fight with the one country that could actually help Canada out of its economic spiral? And the real question, was he doing this for himself, or was he just another puppet in a much bigger game? Narration. Because let's be clear, Ford's threats weren't just empty. They were stupid. The idea that Canada, a country whose entire economy depends on trade with the United States, could hurt America was laughable. Who do you think was going to feel the pain first, the U.S., a self-sufficient economic powerhouse, or Canada, whose industries were already collapsing under Carney's reckless leadership? Factories shutting down, unemployment rising, investors pulling out. And yet, Ford stood there pretending he had leverage. But here's what he didn't expect. Americans weren't scared. They weren't worried. They barely even reacted because they knew Trump had already secured the backup plans. They knew America wasn't going to suffer. But Canadians, they were about to feel the full weight of Ford's arrogance. It started small, just a few businesses at first. Trucking companies in Ontario that relied on cross-border shipments suddenly found themselves stuck. Their deliveries delayed, their contracts slipping away. Then it spread. Construction projects halted as the cost of materials skyrocketed. Grocery stores raised prices on imported goods. And for the first time, Ford's voters, his own base, started asking questions because they remembered what he promised them. They remembered when he said he was going to fight for jobs, lower costs, and protect families. And now he was siding with the very people who were making life harder for them. The same globalists pushing for high taxes, for open borders, for anti-business policies. The same elites who hated Trump not because of his policies, but because he stood in their way. And Ford, whether he admitted it or not, was now doing their bidding. Trump didn't let it slide. Doug Ford thinks he can hurt America, he said in a fiery statement. Good luck with that. The only people Ford is hurting are Canadians. And he was right. While Ford talked tough, Trump acted. He fast-tracked new energy deals, expanded domestic manufacturing, and made sure that whatever Canada tried to withhold from the U.S. was instantly replaced. That's what leadership looks like. That's what putting your country first means. Meanwhile, Ford was scrambling. The media in Canada wouldn't report it, but behind closed doors, the pressure was building. His own advisors warned him this wasn't sustainable. Businesses were furious. The public was losing patience. And worst of all, the truth was getting out. Ford wasn't fighting for Canadians anymore. He was playing politics with their livelihoods. And so the cracks began to show. The once confident premier started dodging questions. Reporters asked him about rising costs, and he blamed Trump. They asked about job losses, and he pointed fingers at Washington. But the excuses weren't working, because people weren't blind. They could see what was happening. They knew that every bad decision, every price hike, every lost paycheck was coming from inside Canada, not from across the border. And that's when Ford really started to panic. Because he knew that once people realized the truth, once they saw him for what he had become, it was only a matter of time before his entire political career collapsed. That's the danger of siding with the wrong people. Ford thought he was making a power move. He thought he could stand against Trump, that he could hold America hostage. But the problem with trying to make a statement is that eventually you have to deal with the consequences. And now, Ford wasn't just fighting Trump. He was fighting his own people. The backlash was only beginning. And the question wasn't whether Ford had made a mistake. The question was how long it would take before even he had to admit it. While Ford was out front making empty threats against America, something much bigger was happening in the shadows. Mark Carney wasn't acting alone. He wasn't just a rogue leader making reckless decisions out of personal spite for Trump. No, this was coordinated. This was planned. And the proof? Just days before Carney announced Canada was cutting ties with the U.S., he held a private meeting with some of Europe's most powerful globalist elites. What were they talking about? Why was Canada's Prime Minister, who had only been in office for a short time, already taking cues from foreign billionaires? And most importantly, what did they want from Canada? Because here's what the media wouldn't report. This wasn't about Trump. This wasn't even about Canada. This was about control. The same global elites that had been pushing climate lockdowns, digital currencies, and radical social policies were now trying to reshape the global economy. And Canada, it was their test subject. By breaking away from the U.S., Carney wasn't making Canada stronger. He was making it more dependent on the very forces that wanted to erase national sovereignty altogether. And when you follow the money, the picture gets even clearer. European investors had been quietly buying up Canadian industries for months. Energy, agriculture, manufacturing. They weren't betting on Canada's future. They were positioning themselves to own it. Carney knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't some naive politician making a bad economic call. He was handing over his country to foreign influence, all under the guise of being independent from the U.S. But the joke was on him. Canada wasn't becoming independent. It was becoming a client state, a playground for the very elites Trump had spent years fighting against. And here's the kicker. These same elites weren't suffering. While Canadian businesses crumbled, while jobs disappeared, while working-class families struggled to put food on the table, the billionaires in Carney's inner circle got richer. They didn't need a thriving Canadian economy. They thrived on economic chaos. Because when a nation collapses, when people are desperate, that's when they take total control. Trump saw it a mile away. They're not just trying to hurt America, he told supporters at a rally. They're selling out their own people. They're turning Canada into a puppet state. He wasn't wrong. Carney had aligned himself with the same figures who pushed for the European Union to erase national borders. The same people who cheered when UK farmers were crushed by environmental mandates. The same forces who had spent years trying to dismantle American energy independence. And now they had their hands deep in Canada. But here's the part they didn't count on. Canadians were waking up. The people who had blindly trusted their government, who had believed the media's narrative that Trump was the enemy, were starting to see the cracks in the story. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. Questions started popping up everywhere. If Carney was so focused on protecting Canada, why was the economy tanking? If breaking from America was such a great plan, why were foreign investors the only ones benefiting? If Canada was truly independent now, why did it feel like it was more controlled than ever before? And the biggest question, who was really running the show. Because it sure as hell wasn't the Canadian people. They weren't the ones pushing for this disaster. They weren't the ones meeting with global financiers behind closed doors. They weren't the ones benefiting from the chaos. Carney had bosses, and they weren't in Canada. For years the left had mocked Trump supporters for saying the system was rigged. They laughed at the idea of a deep state, of politicians working for outside interests instead of their own people. But now even some of Carney's former supporters were starting to see the reality. Because what do you call it when a leader of a country sells out his economy, hands control over to foreign billionaires, and ignores the will of his own people? That's not leadership. That's globalism. That's subservience. That's betrayal. The elites had played this game before. They had thought Canada would be an easy win. But what they didn't count on, what they never count on, is the people. Because no matter how much money they pour into the system, no matter how many politicians they buy off, they can't control what happens when people wake up. And in Canada, people were starting to wake up. The question now wasn't whether Canada would recover. It was whether Carney and his globalist handlers had already done too much damage for it to come back. A handful of truckers demanding answers outside Parliament. But then something shifted. The frustration that had been bubbling beneath the surface, the rising costs, the layoffs, the economic freefall, finally boiled over. And suddenly, it wasn't just business owners. It was everyone. Farmers, factory workers, retirees watching their savings shrink, young Canadians unable to find jobs. People from every corner of the country were waking up to a harsh reality. Mark Carney's decision to cut ties with the U.S. wasn't just some political maneuver. It was a disaster, a man-made, globalist-engineered disaster. And now, regular Canadians were paying the price. The media tried to ignore it at first. They called it right-wing outrage, claimed it was just a vocal minority upset with progress. But reality had a way of breaking through the lies. Every week, the protest grew. By mid-month, thousands were in the streets. By the end of the month, the demonstrations had spread to every major city in Canada. And this time, the media couldn't ignore it. Because here was the thing, these weren't just conservatives. These were people who had voted for Carney. People who had believed the narrative, who had trusted that their government was looking out for them. And now they were watching their livelihoods collapse. The truckers who once delivered goods across the border were sitting idle in parking lots, their rigs useless. The factory workers who used to make car parts for American automakers were lining up at unemployment offices. The farmers who once shipped food south were forced to dump unsold produce as markets dried up. The pain was real. The suffering was real. And for the first time, people weren't buying the government's excuses. Trump saw what was happening. He had been warning about it from the start. Carney doesn't care about Canada, he said in an interview. He's too busy pleasing his globalist friends. But guess what? The people of Canada, they're not going to take this lying down. And he was right. Canadians weren't taking it anymore. The hashtag #CarneyMustGo exploded on social media. The government tried to censor it, but the momentum was unstoppable. Live streams of protests were watched by millions. Families shared stories of their struggles. And for the first time, even left-leaning Canadians started asking questions. The government's response? Denial, deflection, gaslighting. They blamed Trump. They blamed economic instability. They blamed disruptions in global markets. But no one was buying it, because one country wasn't experiencing disruptions. One country's markets were still booming. One country's economy was untouched by Canada's collapse. And that was America. While Canada spiraled, Trump had already secured new trade deals, ensuring that whatever Canada tried to withhold was instantly replaced. The U.S. economy was thriving. Businesses were expanding. Wages were rising. Meanwhile in Canada, the exact opposite. And that's when the fractures within Carney's own party began to show. Cabinet ministers started leaking reports that Carney had been warned about this months ago, but he ignored the advice. Lawmakers who had once backed him began quietly distancing themselves. The political class knew what was coming. The people weren't just angry. They were turning against the government. And once that happens, there's no going back. So what does a desperate government do when it starts losing control? It cracks down. First, they tried intimidation. Protesters were arrested on vague public order charges. Bank accounts of organizers were frozen. But it didn't stop the movement. Instead, it grew stronger. The more the government tried to silence people, the louder they became. Carney had thought he could sell out his country and get away with it. But now the people were waking up. They saw the lies. They felt the betrayal. And most importantly, they weren't afraid anymore. The question wasn't if Carney's government would fall. The question was how much longer he could hold on before his own party turned on him. 10 factories shut down in a single week. Lumber prices up 15%. Grocery stores struggling to keep shelves stocked. The housing market trembling as construction projects stalled. Mark Carney's bold decision to sever ties with the United States wasn't just a political move anymore. It was a full-blown economic disaster. And yet, as businesses collapsed and families struggled to afford basic necessities, Carney remained silent. No apology. No acknowledgement of the crisis he had caused. Nothing. But silence wasn't going to save him. Because outside the polished halls of Ottawa, the country was falling apart. At first, the media tried their usual tricks. They blamed global trends. They blamed market fluctuations. They even tried to blame Trump, as if the man running a booming U.S. economy was somehow responsible for Canada's meltdown. But there was one problem with their spin. People weren't stupid. Canadians weren't watching their gas prices climb because of market trends. They weren't losing their jobs because of unforeseen circumstances. They were suffering because of a single catastrophic decision made by their own prime minister. A decision made not for the good of the country, but out of sheer spite for Trump. Meanwhile, south of the border, America was thriving while Canada floundered. Trump had already secured new trade deals, Brazil, Mexico, even domestic suppliers. Every industry Canada thought they controlled, Trump had replaced in a matter of weeks. The result? Americans barely felt a thing. Gas prices remained stable. Lumber costs held steady. Markets stayed strong. While Canadians braced for recession, Americans moved forward without a scratch. And Canadians saw it. They saw that America had moved on without them. They saw that Trump had outmaneuvered their leadership. And that realization, that gut punch moment of clarity, turned frustration into rage. The protests that had started as scattered demonstrations were now mass movements. Entire industries were revolting: truckers, farmers, energy workers. The very backbone of Canada's economy had had enough. Major corporations began speaking out, warning that if Carney didn't reverse course, the economic damage would be irreversible. Even some of his closest political allies began questioning his leadership. But still, Carney refused to admit reality. Instead of taking responsibility, he doubled down. His government announced emergency measures to deal with rising inflation and job losses. Code for higher taxes, more regulations, and more government control. The same failed policies that had brought Canada to this point in the first place. The backlash was immediate. The more Carney tried to tighten his grip, the more the country slipped through his fingers. His approval ratings, once comfortably high, plummeted to historic lows. His speeches were met with boos. His public appearances filled with angry Canadians demanding answers. And behind the scenes, the cracks were spreading. More leaks. More defections. Whispers from within his own party that the situation was spiraling too far, too fast. Political survival instincts were kicking in. The question wasn't if Carney would be forced out. It was when. But Carney's biggest problem wasn't the protests, or the collapsing economy, or even the loss of political allies. His biggest problem was the American response. Because while Canada burned, Trump wasn't sitting idle. He was watching. He was waiting. And he was preparing his next move. Because if Canada thought things were bad now, they were about to learn what real consequences felt like. Mark Carney's government had spent weeks pretending that everything was under control, that the economic collapse was just a temporary bump, that protests were nothing more than right-wing hysteria. But reality doesn't care about spin. Factories were closing. Food prices were climbing. Investment was drying up. And the worst part, Trump wasn't lifting a finger to stop it. America had moved on. The U.S. economy was booming. Trade routes had been rerouted. And for the first time in modern history, Canada was no longer relevant. Inside Parliament, the cracks in Carney's inner circle were turning into full-blown fractures. Leaked reports showed that even his closest advisors had warned him months ago. Cutting ties with the U.S. would cripple Canada's economy. But Carney had ignored them. Why? Because this was never about Canada's future. It was about his ego. He thought he could stand up to Trump. Thought he could lead a progressive charge against the most powerful economy in the world. Instead, he led his own country into freefall. And now, the people who once propped him up were scrambling to distance themselves. Behind closed doors, meetings were happening. Senior officials were reaching out quietly, carefully, to U.S. contacts, hoping to rebuild burned bridges. They weren't saying it outright, but the message was clear. They needed America. They needed Trump. But here's the problem: Trump didn't need them. And for the first time, Canada had no leverage. The people knew it too. The protests weren't slowing down. They were growing. The streets of Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, all packed with furious Canadians demanding answers. Farmers dumping unsold crops in front of government buildings. Truckers blocking highways, paralyzing supply chains. The same working-class people that Carney claimed to represent were now his biggest enemy. And yet, he still refused to admit what was happening. Then came the breaking point. A closed-door emergency meeting, meant to be private, was leaked to the press. The transcript was damning. Cabinet members openly questioned whether Carney could remain in office. High-ranking officials admitted that their strategy had failed. One even suggested reaching out to Trump directly, an unthinkable move just weeks ago. But that's what desperation does. It forces people to face the truth. And the truth was simple. Canada could not survive without the U.S. And still, Carney held firm. He refused to back down. To admit defeat would be to admit that Trump was right. And to the progressive elite, nothing was worse than that. But Carney was playing a game he couldn't win. Because while he clung to his delusions, the people had already made up their minds. His government was collapsing. His support was gone. And the only thing left to decide was how much longer he could hold on before his own party forced him out. But the real question wasn't whether Carney would survive politically. The real question was whether Canada could survive the damage he had done. Because while Carney could be replaced, while new elections could be held, the economic destruction was real. The loss of credibility was real. The suffering of millions of Canadians was real. And south of the border, Trump was still watching. Still waiting. Because Carney wasn't the only problem. The people who had pushed him into this mess, the globalists who had encouraged him to cut ties with the U.S., the elites who saw Canada as just another chess piece in their game, they weren't done yet. And if Canada thought it had already hit rock bottom, they hadn't seen anything yet. Lumber deals secured with Brazil. New energy contracts signed with Mexico. Trade routes adjusted. Supply lines reinforced. America had moved on. Canada had bet everything on a losing hand, and now they were left with nothing. Mark Carney had thought he could play economic hardball with the most powerful nation on earth. But all he had really done was make his own country irrelevant. And now, for the first time in its modern history, Canada was watching from the sidelines as the world kept turning without it. The Canadian economy was unraveling at a terrifying speed. Factories weren't just slowing down, they were shutting down. The automotive sector, once a cornerstone of Canada's industry, was bleeding jobs as American manufacturers turned to suppliers in Mexico and Asia. The oil sector, already battered by Carney's radical green policies, was collapsing under the weight of its own regulations. The banking system, once one of the most stable in the world, was showing signs of strain as investors fled the country. Even the tech sector, long seen as Canada's future, was now losing top talent to the United States, where opportunities remained abundant. And yet, even as the country crumbled, Carney refused to admit defeat. His administration was scrambling behind the scenes, reaching out to allies, trying to broker emergency trade deals with Europe and Asia. But the reality was unavoidable. No other country could replace what Canada had lost. The U.S. had been its economic lifeline, its biggest customer, its closest partner. Without America, Canada had no future. The protests had evolved into something more dangerous, a full-blown national revolt. Government buildings were surrounded by angry citizens demanding Carney's resignation. Businesses refused to pay new taxes meant to stabilize the economy. Even members of parliament, many of whom had once blindly supported Carney, were now calling for his removal. His coalition was collapsing from the inside. And for the first time, it became clear that his days in office were numbered. But here was the problem. Getting rid of Carney wouldn't fix the mess. Even if his party removed him, even if a snap election was called, even if Canada tried to reverse course, the damage had already been done. The world had changed. America had changed. And Trump had no reason to welcome Canada back with open arms. Because in Washington, the attitude was simple. Why should we help them now? They had made their choice. They had turned their backs on the U.S., believing they could survive without American markets, American security, American trade. And now that they were sinking, they wanted a lifeline. Trump's advisors weren't buying it. The Republican-led Congress wasn't buying it. And most importantly, Trump himself wasn't buying it. Carney was finished. That much was obvious. But what wasn't obvious was whether Canada itself could recover. The economy wasn't just in trouble. It was fundamentally broken. Trust in the government was shattered. And the nation's place on the global stage had been permanently damaged. And yet, through all of this, there was still one unanswered question. Trump had won. But was he done yet? Because for Canada, the worst might not have even arrived yet. And Trump wasn't the kind of man to let a political victory go to waste. The economy shattered, businesses in ruin, protests turning into something far worse, a complete rejection of the government. Mark Carney had lost control. His allies abandoned him. His approval ratings had collapsed. And inside Parliament, the whispers had turned into open rebellion. It wasn't a question of if he would be removed, but when. The country was leaderless, rudderless, spiraling toward an outcome no one could predict. But here was the brutal truth. Even if Carney resigned tomorrow, even if an election was called and a new government sworn in, it wouldn't change the fact that Canada had already lost everything. Because while Canada burned, America thrived. Trump had won. He had watched his northern neighbor unravel, never lifting a finger to stop it. He didn't need to. Canada had done this to itself. Every industry they thought gave them leverage had been replaced. Every resource they thought America couldn't live without had been sourced elsewhere. And now Canada stood on the edge of irrelevance. Carney's party scrambled to contain the damage. Emergency meetings, secret negotiations, desperate outreach to Washington. But it was too late. When Canadian diplomats reached out to quietly ask if Trump would consider reopening trade talks, the White House didn't even bother to respond. The U.S. wasn't interested in saving Canada. Why should they be? After everything Carney and his progressive allies had done, after every attempt to weaken Trump, to defy him, to stand in his way, now they wanted help? Trump, as always, was 10 steps ahead. His administration had already locked in trade deals with stronger, more stable partners. America wasn't looking back. And even if Canada begged to be let back in, Trump held all the cards. If they wanted a deal now, they'd take it on his terms. No negotiations. No special favors. No return to the way things were. And so, as Carney's government collapsed and Canada braced for an uncertain future, Trump made his final move, a nationally televised address broadcast to millions. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply told the truth. For years, Canada thought they didn't need America. For years, their leaders chose globalism over their own people. They chose to sell out their industries, to abandon their workers, to open their borders to crime and drugs. They thought they could hurt America. But America didn't even notice. And now their economy is in ruins. Their government is falling apart. And their people are demanding answers. But the only answer is this. This was their choice. That was it. The final blow. The moment Canada realized that the old world was gone, that the relationship they once had with America was never coming back. And as the dust settled, as the reality of their collapse set in, one question remained. Who had really been pulling the strings all along? Because Carney might have been the face of this disaster, but he hadn't acted alone. There were forces behind him, powerful interests that had used Canada as a pawn in a much larger game. And if Canada had fallen this easily, who was next?